hello, and welcome to the Radical World Podcast. I'm Jose Leal, and my partner Matt Perez isn't here today. We do have a pretty awesome guest, Francois Nuco. Nuco? Nuco? I don't know. I get it. Francois, we have had a few conversations over the years. We've met a few times, so here and there, and it's a
hmm
pleasure to have you on the podcast. Welcome.
No, thank you very much, Jose.
You
Yeah.
are you're welcome to be here, and even more welcome now that you can pronounce my name. So that's good. So, Francois, you're in the UK. How long have you been
Yes,
in the UK?
that's correct. Well, I've been in the UK for over 20 years now, so for much longer than I ever thought I would ever be. I mean, I never.
Originally from France.
No. I was actually born in this country, so I am actually British.
Oh,
But my parents were Swiss, so that's why you've got both the
ah,
French and the Germanic names in my first and last names. But I moved to the UK from Japan, where I lived for over 20 for not just under 20 years, and that's really what sort of threw me into a different world, into a different way of thinking about things and looking at the world and looking at work.
oh, I did
So,
not know that about you because Japan has been, since I was a child, the place that I've wanted to visit. For some
oh
reason,
right,
it has had a super appeal to me, and I've never gotten out there. I lived in Canada for 25, here in the States for 25, and in Portugal as well.
oh
Not
right,
for
okay.
25 in Portugal.
Mm.
That would make me a little older than I am, um, but yes, I've never actually been to Asia. So
All right, okay,
yeah,
yeah.
I look
Well,
forward to it.
so when you're looking at different radical ways of looking at the world, I mean, that's a good place to start. It is, it is really quite different. And but just to add to that, since you've been in Canada, I've also lived in Canada, so
Where in Canada?
in Montreal. Well, most of the time in Montreal. I was a student in Montreal.
Oh, okay. McGill.
Yeah, McGill. Yeah.
Okay. I
So,
was in Toronto, but I worked for a Quebec company, Quebecor.
yeah. All right.
Uh,
Okay.
so I was down there quite a lot,
hmm
quite regularly.
Yeah.
So so tell us a little bit about, like, why you're involved in this, what I'd call the future of workspace, or the evolution of work. What has gotten you here? What led you to this time and place?
Well, it was largely my experience in Japan, although my thinking about it probably already exists before Japan, because that's the reason I went to Japan in the first place.
Mm,
But and because I was looking to understand a culture and a language, and I studied the language, which was completely outside of our Western framework. So outside the Indo-Germanic sort of roots. So all European languages are all different, but they're all similar in many respects
mhm,
in terms of the way of thinking and so on. And um, but what I found there was, and that was the original reason I went there. But what I found there in the world of work was something totally different, and it's sort of completely changed a lot of ways I was looking at things, the way we had been brought up. It was really it turned me around. But essentially, at the same time, it's only when I came back to the UK that I realized that, because it was a process that happened sort of naturally. I sort of adapted to the way of life and so on, and so one could say I had a bit of a culture shock when I went there. I did,
right.
and because it is so different. But but my biggest culture shock was actually coming back to the Western world, because I got so used to things that made so much sense to me, and this is right at the heart of what we're talking about. It's about collaboration, teamwork, and working working together, collaborative decision making, and all those things that I think we're both talking about.
Right.
Um, that I actually lived. So it wasn't a theoretical um, a theoretical sort of premise, but I actually lived there, and so it's the contrast of coming back here that sort of made me aware of
And I want to dig a little deeper into that. But so the topic today that we chose was rethinking collaboration, unlearn to relearn. And so your point, I think, and the reason for choosing that topic is we have so much to let go of
mm,
and so much to learn from a new perspective, from a new angle, because all too often we just want to tweak the thing we got, right? Like, okay, well, I have a company and I work there, and we're going to tweak the way the company works, and we're going to tweak the way I work, and hopefully they'll get better. And I think what you're saying is it may not be that easy. We've got to do a lot more unlearning and relearning of some basic fundamental changes in the way we see the world of work. Is that a fair way to put it?
yeah, that's one way of putting it, and I'd add to that. It's okay. It's the way we see things, the way we perceive things, the different perspectives, and all of that is definitely one aspect. But it's also the way we achieve things. So the skills and competencies that we have learned in our society, which we learn basically at school.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you think back at school, we're all sitting. Well, so, it's changed a little bit nowadays, but we were all sitting in desks in rows and so on. And there was very little um, uh, collaborative learning. It was all
Right.
a teacher to student, um, and it was all based on testing. You learned and test and pass test and so on, and that's ingrained in us,
Mm-hmm.
and especially in us, the people who are leaders, but is ingrained in us, all of us, that we have to know the answer because we've always been tested. And
Well,
so
not only do we have to know, only we need to know. We can't talk to other people about it. We can't, right? Like it's not a collaborative process of learning.
mm,
It's a
mm,
individualistic process of learning and an individualistic process of testing.
exactly. And um, and it's also, I mean, I didn't include that in the title, but there's also another word that I use, and that's unknowing. Which is when you unlearn, you in a state of unknowing, you don't know. And we find it very difficult to at least as leaders, we find it very difficult to say I don't know, and yet that is exactly what we should be in a position to do, because it's only when you unknow that you can start thinking and co-creating and thinking in different ways.
And
And
the process of unknowing or unlearning is really one of disbelief, in essence, because you don't forget what you knew. You don't completely not know it anymore, but really it's a state of saying, well, I used to think that this was the way that this worked, and I don't think that's the way this works anymore. Now I have to discover what does, right?
yes, and that's definitely one aspect. But I'll give you an example. So a famous example, Toyota, the car manufacturer, they actually trained their managers or their coaches who were more like coaches than they were managers, at least from a Western perspective, to always respond to questions that are given to them by their subordinates or by whoever, doesn't matter, with the automatic reflex is not to answer the question, but to say, I don't know, even if they knew the answer. To say I don't know as a matter of habit, and then what do you think? And let's talk about it. And that opens up that even if you do know an answer, uh, we're not fixed with that answer. It opens up the possibility of other answers, of a multitude of passes, and the answer you initially may be the right one, but it may not. But if we just answer immediately, then we shut the discussion down, and the process of unknowing and not knowing is actually opens it up.
But
That's
we also reinforce the all-knowing idea, right? That the
yeah, well,
boss knows it
exactly.
all,
Yeah,
right?
well, indeed. Yes.
So I've come to think that really this future of workspace is about it is collaboration, and
Mm,
that the concept of work and job and career to me has become an old-fashioned idea
yeah.
that
Mm,
that that we are going to have something that occupies our lives, that it's going to be with an organization that's going to tell us what to do, when to do it, how to do it, why do it, and so on and so forth. That we've given up as humans. We've given up our ability to have autonomous evolution of our own personal lives because we've sort of held on to these beliefs about what work is and how we work and so on and so forth. Does that feel right to you? And is that the work that you guys are doing?
Yes, so definitely we're holding on to. I don't think it's just beliefs. They are definitely beliefs, but there are also patterns that we have just adopted from our
Mm-hmm.
education, and which we don't. And the thing is, we don't even realize we have them. See,
Right.
that's the whole point. When you go completely outside, or like a fish out of water, when you come outside of the of your culture, you suddenly things that you just take, we don't even think about them because they're just what you feel as natural, and people don't think. It's only when you come outside that you suddenly have to think about these things in a way that you never did. And so when we're talking about changing our world for the better, having changing work, you can't do that. What I believe is it's not enough to just talk about them, just to think about them, talk about them, and so on.
Right.
There are actual skills and competencies that we actually have to learn that we never learned. And
Well,
mm,
no, please go ahead, finish.
well, I was just going to add, that I learned them because I learned them in that different culture, and so
Right.
I had to learn them. Um, and other people do also. Of course, lots of other people do learn them, um, but it's not something that comes naturally.
Right.
And I have seen people who are radical thinkers who themselves are stuck in certain ways. So there are some radical thinkers who would still lead a discussion and be in charge and not let go and not enable a dialogue, for example. So I'm just
Well, let me ask you a question. I'm the one
mm.
that's supposed to be asking questions here. So, um, um, so trying to paint a picture here from the radical world perspective, because
Mm,
what I think you've just described is a twofold thing that we call a fiat system or a fiat world. And that is that we've, these patterns you've described and these ideas we've both described stem from this understanding of the world that we need to be in control. We
mm,
need to control organizations. We need to control each other. We need to control society. And as a whole, that concept, that principle of if we are not in control, then all hell breaks loose,
mm, mm, mm,
right? And so the manager needs to say, I have the answer, and here's the way you do it, and you can't do anything but. And all of those patterns and beliefs are tied up into this thing. And when we Westerners, and brought up in this fiat system, when we look at people being fiat, meaning that they're command and control and that dictate what should and should not be, that to us, it's sort of like, yeah, that's the way the world works. I'm not happy about it. I don't think that person should be telling me what to do, but of course, that's the way it works.
Mm,
How often do you hear that, where people just sort of say, "Why do you want to change that? That makes no sense to want to change something that is just the way that it should be."
mm. Well, I would say 20 years ago, I would have heard that a lot. I would say I'm hearing it increasingly less, because I do believe that there is an awareness that what was is no longer working, and therefore people are a little bit more open, or to let go, and at least conceive of there might be other ways. So I do hear it a little less than I've done in the past, but
May
but
I
it's still
may I,
very strong there.
may I suggest that it is a little less, but I think it's a
Mm.
little less in the circles we travel in.
Oh, well, maybe.
I
Well, yes.
suspect, I suspect that
Mm,
in the circles where we don't travel in,
mm,
where folks are in their day-to-day lives and their day-to-day work and their day-to-day society and
mm.
community, that I suspect maybe it's not changing that much there.
Yes, unfortunately, sometimes when I put my other glasses on, I get depressed. But yeah.
Well, that's something you and I share then, Francois, because I know the feeling very well. Um, so it seems, I mean, I think we're looking at the world from a very similar lens. We
Mm,
call
mm,
it the radical lens, and the radical lens is one of, we have the autonomy, we have the ability to see things from a place of collaboration rather than a place of force. So
mm.
how do we move towards that? And that's the work you and the folks at Go Fish are working on. What is that work? What does that look like? And how do you see both individuals going through this process, but our society going through this process? What does that look like to you?
Yeah, so there's not one answer to that, or one aspect to that. There's several aspects to that. Um, there's the aspect, yeah, I guess you could call it the legal side to that, and that would be changing the way that organizations are governed, the way they are owned, the whole principle of ownership, and so on. Um, uh, that's a whole area, a huge area, which I'm not particularly looking at, but of course I've got my eye on it, because without it, without the infrastructure and the correct architecture, and without the systems, I mean, because we're a victim of the systems, and if the system doesn't change, then all the other things don't change so easily either. But it's a kind of catch 22, or chicken and egg, because you can't change the system without the habits and the thinking and the behaviors to go with it, and vice versa. Without you can't change the behaviors without the system. So it's a very you've got to sort of attack them from from all ends.
If I
But the
may,
particular
I'm going to jump in because I think your point is super valid. We have not only the system of work, as in the architecture of the organization, but the organization as a conceptual entity within the concept of our society,
mm, mm,
which is also a conceptual entity that allows for the framing of organizations as we see them today.
mm,
And then what you're saying is, how do we show up within those structures is sort of the thing that you're working on. I just wanted
mm.
to paint that picture again, because our work is really sort of trying to figure out, how do we do this all at once,
Yes, yes, yes.
because we can't do one and hope that the other will change, and vice versa.
Yes, yes, and I've been involved in a number of projects and a number of other another other companies, if you want, or
Hmm.
collectives, where we've looked, or where we've looked at different aspects, those different kinds of aspects. I'm currently focused specifically on the skills and competencies, which is just one aspect, because my point is really that there are certain skills and competencies that need to be learned, without which people are never going to be able to shift into a different way. So we talk about having organizations and teams without bosses or without managers, self-organization and so on. But self-organizing is very difficult because we don't actually have the skills. We never learned the skills because it's not something we ever did um, um, in
Growing
our
up, yeah.
in our education. And there are specific skills that nobody teaches, basically, and part of the and that in itself, just saying those words is in fact wrong, because it's not about teaching those skills, it's about us learning those skills
Experiencing those skills, yeah.
and experiencing those skills. So just a simple example, I mean, taking decisions collaboratively is not something that we ever learned to do, and so we revert to very primitive forms of decision making. Either we leave it to somebody to make the decision, or we battle it out. I mean, the principle of debates is something I'm profusely against, because it's about battle. It's about we have a very violent form of actually of dealing with things, which
Yeah, yeah.
and that's not because that's the way we want it to be. It's simply because it's the only way we've learned to
Those are
be.
the patterns we've experienced throughout our
Exactly,
lives.
exactly. And so, really, what I'm, and I don't pertain to have any solutions. I have some ideas and some potential solutions, but this is a work in progress that I'm sort
Of course.
of working on, and it's really how do we impart and learn these skills, these collaborative, what I call well, I call them social skills, because they're skills that you can only learn. You can't learn it at desk by in reading a book,
Right.
nor can you learn them by yourself. You see, if you look at most education programs, most training programs, they're all about individual learning.
Exactly.
There's very little out there that deals with collaborative learning or social learning and learning together. And yet, if you're learning to make decisions collaboratively, the only way you can do that is by practice. I mean, you can learn a few principles by yourself, that's fine, but the only way you can perfect that is by actually practicing. But you can't practice by yourself. You
Right.
have to practice with other people. It's like, I mean, there are certain things that we do in our Western world. We do as teams, like football or team sports. you can't you can't perfect your at least the team aspect of football by practicing by yourself. You can learn a few skills, a
Right.
few
Right.
tricks, and so on. But so certain things we do know in the West how to do, but not so much in the business world, or not so much in an organizational world.
And your point, I think, is very well received. And I was actually going to say that because I think even the idea of personal growth,
Mm, exactly. Mm.
right? Personal growth. I need to grow personally. And then once I personally grow, then I'll be able to deal with people.
Mm, mm, mm,
I'm not sure that we can personally grow. I think we really are in the process of learning how to collaboratively do just about everything that we do.
mm,
Because, as you point out, we don't have patterns for how to collaboratively live.
mm,
Never mind work, never mind have relationships, never mind have children, never mind vote, all of the things that we do, but we don't know how to do those things collaboratively.
mm, mm, mm,
And in part, back to, the structure, if you have an organization that has a boss, that has an owner, that tell you what to do, it is really, really hard to learn how to be collaborative.
mm, mm.
But if you have a mindset and a set of patterns that you've adopted because that's what was given to you in your life, it is really difficult to see the world from a collaborative lens,
Mm,
because that way of seeing the world, as you point out in your experience in Japan, is not native to us and to our upbringing.
mm.
How do we understand that those patterns, that those behaviors, that knowledge is something we need to unlearn? Where do we start with that?
So I again, this is a work in progress, but I would start from the premise that um, you don't tell people what they need to unlearn, because that in itself, just the telling, is a, 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 a wrong starting point to begin with. It's very much having the ability to have the open conversations, first of all, to consider these things, and because anything else is quite frightening. um, you can't just tell people you everything you've learned so far is just rubbish. Just throw it out the water, because that's not going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
People cling on to things. Probably the starting point would be a conversation, but conversation by itself is not going to achieve anything. It's just, but it is it is at least to create the safe space. And conversation does not happen by itself. It is something that happens in with other people, which is why for me dialogue is one essential feature, because dialogue is very much about enabling the flow of meaning. That's the origin of the word dialogue. The flow of meaning or the dance of ideas,
Mm-hmm.
another way I put it, to emerge and to evolve. Um, that's a starting point, but there are specific skills which also have to be practiced, and there are certain other skills. And so there's one part that's the unlearning bit, and there are certain habits. It's like learning to redo everything you do, but with your other hand. So if you're left-handed or right-handed, it doesn't matter which one you use. You suddenly decide to do it with the other hand, and you unlearn what you've done with one hand, and you relearn what you've done with the other. And that's not so that's not so easy, as anybody who's tried will tell you. And but it's a dexterity of the interaction between people, which I'm
I,
really talking about.
I'm going to throw a bit of a wrench into our conversation because
Mm.
um, I have a sense that for most people, middle age and older, they're not going to learn to use their other hand.
Yeah, no.
Um, and and we're likely not to be seeing a dramatic shift in folks in that age group. But there are some of us that are, for whatever reason, willing to try and able to try, and in some cases succeeding at being able to do that. Can we be, and can those people be the model for the younger generations coming along so that they're learning at a younger age to use this new pattern, this new way of doing it, and that those folks have right now as they're sensing that the way it works isn't working for them, and that they need new patterns, and that those patterns are tested and true and available for them to adopt um, as they're reaching their maturity and their work lives and so forth.
Yes, and I mean that is something that really concerns me, because what is still being taught at school is still the old patterns. So definitely, that's what the one place where we should be, we should be, from a societal point of view, be focusing on is totally rethinking our education. Our education is totally inappropriate for where we are in the world. but that's going to take a generation or two before that, so that happens. So in terms of the older folks, so to speak, I totally agree with you. The majority of the old folks are not going to learn to use their left hand instead of the right. But I do think there are a large number of people now, of all generations, who are understanding that what was and what worked in the past is no longer working, and they don't know what to do about it, but are looking for ways that might be different, and therefore they're more open to the idea. And I think it's so. I would not quite agree that there aren't any no older folk who,
Of
uh,
course, yeah, and
and but that the number are actually increasing. The number who and maybe they find it difficult, but they also come from a premise understanding that there is a need for it. I mean, when you look at the climate crisis and the various crises, it's so obvious that there's a need for it. That I do think the folk, those folk are increasing. So
yes, yes.
and
And I don't disagree. They are
mm,
increasing, and I think
mm,
that there is as you point out, there's a lot of reasons why we need to be and should be focusing on those changes. I just My sense is the that trying to convert people at later stages of life, and forgetting that really the young people are the future, number one, and number two, they're the ones that are,
mm.
um, at this stage of their life, at an earlier stage of their life, much more apt to learn new patterns and to do it in a way that is much more helpful to them than someone in the twilight of their career.
Yeah, yes.
Uh, so for me, that work that you've just described about the unlearning and the relearning and happens, as we said earlier, in in a place where it has to be a relational place, and we can learn from each other. And I don't think that we need to worry about changing schools at this point.
No.
That I think what we need to do is have places where people can practice this in a real world experience, not in an educational setting, but in a practical setting. And that the future of education is a practical setting. It was
Mm,
in the past, and we now have the technology and the ability to integrate much of what we've been doing in a educational setting back into a practical setting. Meaning, we had this idea hundreds of years ago that you could, at a very young age, uh, be part of a learning process of work, learning from a mentor and having these experiences of collaboration and working together and all of that. Not all of it was done right, and not all of it had the insights that I think we have now. Not that they are perfect either, but they're certainly, I think, more involved than they were. But this idea that we have an education that is separate from how we live and how we work, uh, I think continues that same bad patterning. Uh,
mm,
does that
mm.
does that feel right to you?
Yes, well, certainly, uh, but I think the key for me, the key phrase you use is having the spaces where people will learn together, because you're not going to learn together to be together if you're learning by yourself. So you have to be in those spaces, and have to. And I what I'm working on is creating what I'm calling learning labs, which are basically places where people can self-organize to learn certain skills. Where you could say the material, the patterns, and so are there to learn, but they're not dictated by a trainer or teacher, but people learn to learn from each other because peer learning is so powerful.
Hmm.
And yet we make very little use of it. Um,
I would say that I agree with that, but I think we need the practical like not just a practical setting, but a setting that has impact, has utility, that is producing something, that is doing something, as a means of by which to actually experience that, not as a lab that is designed for the sake of the of learning, but a lab for the sake of doing something in which we then learn.
Oh yes, absolutely, and I'm totally for. And this is what I one of the things I learned is on the job learning.
Right.
But learning in principle should be to learn to tackle the actual life tasks. It's not about learning some abstract knowledge and so on. But and there's a lot of that abstract knowledge can be very useful if it's used to tackle specific tasks, rather than pumping us with all that knowledge in advance and so on. So
Someday you will use that,
yeah,
maybe.
well, exactly, and of course you never do, because by the time you could use it, you've forgotten it. So
assuming
so
assuming it hasn't changed.
well, but that's
You
the
know.
other thing. Exactly, exactly. Yeah, and
And
that's the beauty, of course, of the ability to. Okay, one thing that has changed is, of course, our concept of learning and of education, because we used to think, well, you learn when you're young, and you feed young mind with all this stuff, and then gradually over the age it disintegrates and it gets worse and so on. And that is from a neurological perspective, we now know that's completely wrong. Our brains are very plastic and they're constantly rewiring, and so that for me is an area of hope, because it means we can change, we can unlearn and unwire and rewire, relearn, and so on. So it is totally possible, even at whatever age, if
absolutely.
if we put our mind to it. So yeah.
We're running low on time,
Oh
and
yes.
I wanted to learn a little bit more about your colleagues, Brett, and we had uh, Joanna
Joanna.
on
Mm.
a few weeks ago as well, and the work that you folks are doing there. What's sort of the, because that in itself is a novel thing. Everybody sort of is doing their own thing, and they're doing it together as a collective. Um, so tell us a little bit about that, and what work is happening there.
Yeah, well, so our basic idea is, we call ourselves uh, un or anti or de consultants, in the sense that we're uh, uh, I guess from one perspective you could say we're consultants, but on another sense we're not at all, because we're not there to tell anybody anything. In an organization, our main goal is to enable, and by giving them the tools and the knowledge and the skills and so on, for people within organizations to figure out their own solutions, and not to depend on a manager and so on. And but uh, to some degree they currently do depend on somebody, because that's partly because that's the way that's a habit, but partly because they don't have the skills for it, and or
Exactly.
and so this is what we're essentially trying to do, is help them get those skills, whatever it is that's required, so that they can become autonomous, and therefore uh, it then eliminates the need for having managers, at least in a classical sense,
Hmm.
from the organization. I still think people like coordinators who are coordinating the things are still probably, and coaches and people like that are still necessary, but their importance diminishes. It's and they're certainly not directive and so on. So
Right, right.
and that's totally, and they're part of the team. And again, if teams are able to make collaborative decisions together, or to look at things from different perspectives together, then they're much then the need for controllers, if you want, because that's the
Right.
word you use at the beginning,
Yeah.
disappears or diminishes, is reduced.
Absolutely.
So that's really what we as a group was one of the key things that we're looking at. I mean, we're looking at we're doing various things, but that's
Yeah.
maybe the
We
main thing.
we have to
Uh,
experiment, all of us, and see
mm,
where things come from. Um,
exactly.
I'm going to introduce next week's guest, and then
Hmm.
we'll wrap it up from there. So next week
Okay.
we've got Dave Rosenberg. We're going to be talking about radical accountability. Um, the tagline there is determining the root cause of failure and systemic flaws in organizations. So we're flipping from talking with Francois today about mindsets and knowledge and patterns and personal sort of uh, transformation, if you will, to organizational structures and how do we look at the structure and the failures of those structures. So uh, that's what we do here.
Brilliant.
That's what we do. We just
Mm,
go from one side of the spectrum to the other and talk to folks like yourself, Francois, about one aspect or a few aspects of that. But our intention here at Radical World is to paint a bigger picture of what this
mm,
transformation looks like. And
mm,
to us, that transformation looks like a world that is radically different than the one that we see today, that is emerging thanks to people like yourself, Joanna, Brett, and many others that are doing this kind of work. And
mm.
next week, we'll find out from Dave the work that he's doing. So,
Sounds very
Francois,
interesting.
it's been a pleasure. I really appreciate our conversation, and I appreciate the work that you've been doing and your team has been doing, and investing and learning a lot about new patterns and new ways of learning, not
Mm,
teaching, but learning.
mm, mm. Yes, and the pleasure's been mine. It's been a brilliant conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'm very glad that we were able to keep it a conversation and not some Q&A type
Mm, mm,
uh,
mm.
session. So I really appreciate that.
Brilliant. Yes. Mm.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Till next time, we'll see you soon.
Okay. Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye.